You're listening to IRN, the Inception Radio Network, Chicago, Illinois.
You're listening to IRN, 2014 Order Zone International UFO Conference.
He's been called the real Fox Mulder for 21 years. Nick Pope worked for the British government on highly classified investigations into UFO sightings, alien abductions, crop circles, and psychic phenomena. None of the cases he worked on is as powerful and compelling as what he is about to bring to us. The story of an amazing UFO encounter that happened at the United States Air Force Base in Rendlesham Forest, England, in December of 1980. Please welcome one of the world's leading authorities on UFOs, Mr. Nick Pope. Go get him.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dennis. And again, my profound thanks to everyone who has worked so hard to put on this festival, to Brad, to Noe, to the mayor, to the city, everyone else who has worked maybe behind the scenes on some of the organization here, putting together the audio-visual, setting up the room, etc. I have very few slides for this, so if you want to put the house lights up, it's up to you. Thank you too to the musicians. I mean, I just want to say that I think it is a great thing that this festival is more than just a bunch of talks. Interesting though I hope the talks are, I'm really impressed that this is really a combination not just of the presentations, but of a music festival, a parade, a costume party, a skywatch, a ghost hunt. And I think it's really great that the city has gotten behind this and is putting money and effort into building something here. And I get the impression that we're in at the early years of something that's going to grow and grow, and in years to come is going to be a great thing down here. Now, by the way, I thank the musicians. In my small homage to perhaps the Southwest, I am wearing my George Strait shirt here today. And and before I left, when my wife asked me where I was going, I said, I'll be somewhere down in Texas if you're looking for me. Okay, I better not do jokes. That's not what I'm here for. So what I'd like to do is really tell the story of what I think is, now there'll be a debate about this and everyone will have their own personal favorites, but I think it's arguably the world's second best known UFO incident after Roswell. Let's test that. First of all, who here has heard of the Rendlesham Forest incident? Oh, that's great. Okay, good. Well, now, who here has recently seen more than one TV show mentioning Rendlesham Forest? Yeah, this is what I'm noticing. Increasingly, TV production companies and networks, no disrespect to Dennis and other researchers, but I think they're finding it more difficult to make new shows on Roswell, for the obvious reason that obviously many of the direct first-hand witnesses have now passed. So, and in terms of what makes good TV, TV networks and production companies tend to like a mixture of things you've probably seen. They like CGI recreations, they like documents, they like experts, but they do like the witnesses who were actually there, who saw things, who experienced things. And it is more difficult than it used to be, for the reason that I stated, to make shows about Roswell. And increasingly, starting about 3, 4, 5 years ago, and continuing to the present, there are more and more TV shows that are featuring the Rendlesham Forest incident really as almost their flagship case. And I know of, there was Close Encounters, a Canadian show, which I know has been shown down here in the States. Alien Encounters on Science Channel, a whole bunch of other ones. And by the way, at least 2 more in the pipeline that I've been asked not to talk about, simply because obviously networks don't like people kind of letting the cat out of the bag until they've had a chance to do their own publicity. But rest assured, if you like Rendlesham Forest, there's more to come. And what I'm going to do in this final presentation of the evening is basically give an overview of the Rendlesham Forest incident, and then perhaps when Dennis gives me the 15-minute slot, perhaps wherever I am in my presentation, I'll wrap up and then take 15 minutes of questions and comments, which can be about Rendlesham. But hey, I'm not going to be strict about this. If you wanted to ask something about my earlier presentation and didn't get a chance, or if you just want to ask something more generally about my Ministry of Defence work on UFOs in the UK, happy to take that too. So when Dennis catches my eye and says 15 minutes, I'm gonna, wherever I am, I'm gonna stop and turn it over to you for the last 15 minutes. So let me tell you the story of the Rendlesham Forest incident, and some of you will know it well, but some of you, maybe even who have seen it on TV, you know how it is. It's just a soundbite here, a little recreation there. And I think the full story of what happened is incredibly complex, and I'm going to try and give you an overview of it now. I should say one other thing. I think that the Rendlesham Forest incident is almost what I would call a perfect storm of a UFO case. Almost every single factor that makes a UFO incident interesting, compelling, and something that is supported not just by testimony but by other things too. Everything that makes a case interesting and compelling almost comes together in this single incident. And I think that's very important. For a start, it was not a single witness, but it was a multiple witness event. Some people have tried to count the total number of witnesses. Well, even the people, on the record whose name we know who were involved, probably 20 or 30. Those names that we don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than 100. So, multiple witness event. Most of those witnesses were military personnel. Now, that, there's no monopoly on the truth. Doesn't mean that sightings from the general public are any less trustworthy. But I think particularly when it comes to talking to the skeptics about this, it's actually quite compelling when you can turn around and say, well, hey, by the way, if you think it's just crazy people who see UFOs, you can dip into the files at the Ministry of Defence of other nations that have investigated this. You can find police officers, pilots, military personnel, who have seen these things, sometimes up close and personal. So I think it is another interesting part of the story that most of the witnesses, and certainly the witnesses whose story I'm going to tell you now, are military personnel. That, I think, is important in of itself. Multiple witnesses, military witnesses. A multiple, not just witness event in terms of how many people saw this, but this wasn't one night. This was 3 consecutive nights. Again, just things that make a case compelling. Government documents backing up a lot of this, and government documents, the provenance of which is not disputed. Later on, I'm going to tell you about a couple of documents. Skeptics don't say, hey, I think these things might be forged. They'd look pretty silly if they tried, because you can read them on the government's website. These documents are real, and they back up a good part of the story. Physical trace evidence. This UFO was briefly tracked on radar, and when we come on to talk about the heart of the case, you'll see that there's physical trace evidence in terms of things like indentations in the ground, burn marks on the trees, and high levels of radioactivity, because this was not just lights in the sky. This was a structured craft, up close and personal, and actually, on the first night, landed. So this is why I say it's a perfect storm. And you could make a list of things that make a UFO case perhaps important, and you'd pick things maybe like government documents backing it up, radar evidence, military witnesses. All of those things are present in this one case. It takes place in England, in the county of Suffolk, in December 1980, as I mentioned, over a series of 3 nights. And at the heart of this story are 2 military bases, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. Now, although these bases are in England, they are actually United States Air Force bases. Starting in the Second World War and continuing to this day, though on a smaller scale, there has been a huge United States military presence in the United Kingdom. Part of that was involved in helping us Brits win the Second World War. Okay. And, of course, when the Second World War segued into the Cold War, the huge American military presence in the UK, and indeed in other parts of Western Europe, was a huge part of the deterrence that stopped the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact rolling their far greater numbers of tanks westwards, and arguably preventing a Third World War through that American military presence in Europe. And, by the way, I think in the world today there is an awful lot of what I would call knocking the United States. Believe me, though the voices and the critics might be quite loud, let me tell you that us Brits, for example, are extremely grateful to the Americans and the American military in particular for the Second World War, for the Cold War, and hopefully for preventing the Third World War. So thanks from a Brit who now, by the way, is an honoured guest in your country. I married an American 4 years ago, and I've lived here for... Thank you. I've lived here in America for 3 years now. We spend our time between San Jose, where my wife is a professor at the university, and Tucson, where we have a beautiful place out in the desert. So I am an honoured guest in your country. So, Bentwaters and Woodbridge are these twin United States Air Force bases in county of Suffolk, England. And I say twin bases. They are extremely close together geographically. Literally, there are just a few hundred yards between them, and in between them lies Rendlesham Forest. And for the historians amongst you, I mentioned the Second World War. Bentwaters and Woodbridge were basically emergency aircraft landing bases from the Second World War when planes had been on bombing missions over Nazi Germany and other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe. When bombers were damaged and were limping back to the UK, they needed very long and wide runways, very close to the east coast, and Bentwaters and Woodbridge were built with that in mind. So that's the history of these bases. But they are, I call them twin bases, and because they are so close together, for command and control purposes in the US military, the twin bases were treated as a single entity. So there was a single officer in overall command, and that of course made a great deal of sense. So if you ever get slightly confused by people talking about Bentwaters, Woodbridge, Rendlesham Forest, the twin bases, it's all basically the same place. And just to put this in some sort of historical context for you, December 1980 was a time of some considerable international tension. Arguably, we were coming up to the greatest period of danger of a Third World War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a big cause of this danger was the Soviet reaction to the rise in power and popularity of the Polish trade union Solidarity. And there was still the very hardline Soviet regime of the ailing President Leonid Brezhnev, but ranged against him was the newly elected hardline Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, who was taking a very tough stance with the Soviets. And of course, in December 1980, though he had not yet been inaugurated, President Ronald Reagan had won the election and was making it very clear that he too was going to take a tough line with the Soviets. And indeed that combination of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher was a political double act, the consequences of which I think are still being felt today in the way it changed the world. So this was the backdrop, the kind of geopolitical backdrop to the Rendlesham Forest incident. And to cut straight to the chase, you're probably thinking, gosh, he's spoken for about 15 minutes and he hasn't even got to the bit about the UFO yet. Well, sorry about that, but I always think it is interesting and important to contextualize some of this and say, well, let's not just tell the story in a vacuum, but let's ask ourselves, what was the backdrop against which all this played out? So I hope that's been important and of interest to you. So we get to the early hours of December 26th, 1980, and law enforcement and security police personnel at the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge on patrol see strange coloured lights out in Rendlesham Forest. And their first thought is that maybe an aircraft has crashed and is burning. Not the military aircraft. They knew that there were no military aircraft from the bases flying. And the main aircraft that they flew, by the way, was the A-10 tank buster, which we, by the way, still see when we're at our place in Tucson. They're still based at Davis-Monthan, and they're still getting extended year on year, but that's another story. So they see these strange lights in the forest, red, blue, white, all sorts of colours, and they think there is this aircraft crash. So they seek and obtain permission to go out into the forest. And I won't bore you with a whole load of jurisdictional kind of information, but the situation regarding American bases on British soil can be quite complex legally and jurisdictionally, but obviously in a situation where you think that lives might be in danger or that there might be a security situation, you can go out beyond the wire. And so the American personnel went off base out into the forest to see what was going on, and if it was an aircraft crash and a fire, obviously to render assistance. As they drove out there in a couple of jeeps, one of the military police made a comment which kind of disconcerted a lot of the other people. And they were talking about this crash, and one of them said, "It didn't crash, it landed." So with this in their minds as they went out there, it perhaps put things into a different light. Now, the names of the people that went out there, the key players in a lot of this are particularly John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. John was an airman, and Jim basically was the security supervisor that night. He was a sergeant. And they were the two people that got closest to this UFO. One of the things that happened as they drove out there in their Jeep is that, firstly, the path they were following into the forest got less and less accessible. So at one point they had to basically stop the Jeep because it was just the trees were too close in to continue driving, and they had to continue on foot. The other thing that happened is the radios started playing up, and these were usually pretty reliable line-of-sight radios, and yet there was a lot of interference, so they kept leaving people behind to set up a communications relay, a radio relay, that they would only work for maybe a few hundred yards, which was highly unusual. Everyone who I've spoken to about the radios said, well, hey, the radios were absolutely the lifeblood of what the security and the law enforcement personnel used, and a whole bunch of other people too, of course. I don't have to tell those of you with police and military backgrounds how central communications is to operational effectiveness, and having a reliable radio is one of the most important things that you can have in that kind of situation. These were reliable pieces of kit, and yet it seemed that something was interfering with them. I'll come back to the concept of interference later. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston went furthest forward. Like I say, other people had been left back, some with the Jeep, some between the Jeep and where Jim and John were pressing right on deep into the forest, and they knew that they were getting incredibly close to this UFO, to this thing, whatever it was. I say UFO, no one had yet used the phrase UFO. John and Jim were treating it as a security situation, a possible plane crash, but whatever it was close proximity to two of the biggest and most strategically important NATO military bases in the entire NATO command structure. Self-evidently, anything weird going on close to Bentwaters and Woodbridge would of itself be of huge security concern. And so John Burroughs and Jim Penniston pressed forward, and there came a point where the trees began to thin out, and they came to a small clearing in the forest. John Burroughs often says that the word clearing is slightly misleading. He says, this thing really was little more than a small gap in the trees, maybe no more than 12, 15 yards across, something like that. Not like a huge space like this auditorium, much smaller. What they found there was not a crashed aircraft, but, well, let me show you Jim's sketch of it. That's Jim Penniston's sketch of the UFO, taken from his police notebook, his original police notebook, which he still has, and Jim has made it perfectly clear to any skeptics who doubt the story that he is completely comfortable with his police notebook being forensicated so that it can be proven that the paper, and specifically the ink on the paper, is contemporary 1980, and that this isn't something that was added in later. And of course, for those of you who watch TV shows like Forensic Files, you'll know that there are a whole bunch of forensic specialists who specialize in document analysis. So the science is there, this can be done, and Jim is quite happy to make this available, and indeed I believe that he has already made it available, I think, to History Channel, who made a show about this some years ago. So in a sense, the forensication has already been done. I don't have to tell you that that's not a crashed aircraft. I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, that that's not a conventional aircraft or drone of really any kind. And one of the things that Jim Penniston had in his duties is he was an aircraft recognition specialist, whether it was aircraft that the Americans themselves had, or whether it was something that the Soviets or indeed other nations have. If it flew, Jim Penniston knew about it, and he really was a deep specialist on this, and he said this was like nothing he'd ever seen before in his life. Now, the first thing that Jim did, he had a camera with him. He shot off a whole roll of film of this thing, but the light from this was quite bright. After he shot off his film, because he'd run out of film, he sketched it in his police notebook. It's a good job he did, because later the base photo processing laboratory told him, "Oh, sorry, Jim, your film didn't come out." Well, there are a whole bunch of people who don't believe that, who think that maybe the powers that be spirited away the film, but Jim and some of the other people involved say, well, actually, the light was so bright that maybe that was a true statement from the base processing lab. And the other thing that I'm going to come on to is radiation at the landing site. And it's quite possible that radioactivity was responsible for the fogging of this film. So for people who are saying, I don't believe it, the government spirited away the film, that's not necessarily true. It might be true, but it might be that a combination of the bright light and the radioactivity genuinely did mean that the film didn't come out in any usable form. I don't know the answer to that particular part of it. Well, Jim decided that after he'd shot off his film and done his sketch, he'd better get as close as he could. So he went right up to this thing. And it's kind of interesting if you talk to Jim and John about what happened to them, and if you talk to some of the other witnesses who went out but stayed a little further back, it's kind of like a whole bunch of people went out into the forest that night, and they all came back with slightly different memories, slightly different perceptions of what exactly happened to them. John Burroughs talks, for example, about a flash of light and suddenly just not being aware of where he was anymore. And you'll hear sometimes from John the phrase, going into the light. Well, I really don't have the time to go into what I suppose might almost become a more New Age presentation. But of course, those of you who are interested not just in UFOs, but in some other paranormal phenomena, mysteries, into maybe more New Age and spiritual things, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, the idea of going into the light, which is a phrase John Burroughs has used, maybe has some other connotations which take us away from UFOs and into the realm of some other phenomena. But for the time being, I'm going to stick, as we've got it, and as it's an important part of the paper trail of this. Like I say, this comes from Jim Penniston's police notebook. I'm going to stick with Jim Penniston's recollection of this. he thought that he had better do his best to document this. At one point, Jim observed a flash of light, and he couldn't really see where John was, and he even thought that John might be down, a casualty, and that he himself might, if this thing, whatever it was hostile, he might not come back from this. So he thought, I've shot off my film, I'll do some sketches. He thought, if I don't come back from this, maybe they'll find the camera. He didn't know at the time the thing about the film. Maybe they'll find my camera, maybe they'll find my police notebook. If I don't survive this, which was going through his mind, maybe they'll find the camera and the notebook, and maybe people will piece together what happened to us. So he wanted to kind of document this to the best of his ability. So he sketched, this is the craft. On the side of the craft were strange symbols that he could only really liken to Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he sketched these symbols too, and they ran along the side of the craft, and he kind of ran his hand along this, and when he touched this final symbol there, the big one, for those of you who have seen a couple of the recent recreations of this on TV, you'll know that when he touched that final symbol, which was larger than the others, there was an immense flash of light. And I'll come on later to what happened to him kind of in his mind. But for the time being, just to keep the story on the craft, I will say that from... Now this thing was about 9 feet across. To go back. Along the... This was back engineered from Roswell, by the way. Along the base there, near as we can figure from what Jim says, the length there is really only about 9 feet. Now, this thing is not big. Bear in mind again what John said about how this wasn't even really what he would call a clearing, more of a small opening in the trees. So that bit was maybe 9 feet, and measured from the bottom to the top, that was maybe about 9 feet too. Well, I don't have time. I mean, obviously, listening to Dennis talk about the Great Pyramids, I certainly don't have time to go down that road of speculation. But I don't have to tell you that whatever it was. Later on, as part of the investigation, they actually poured plaster of Paris into this. And so that was part of the investigation to try to make some calculations about the shape of this craft, and the shape particularly of the part of the craft that had actually been in contact with the ground and had made these indentations. And those plaster casts, at least one of them still exists, and again have been brought out for a couple of the TV shows on this. Now, the other thing that they saw at the landing site while they were waiting for the lightholes to come out was that the sides of the trees facing the clearing seemed to be damaged. Branches had been smashed off, and just exactly in a way that would be consistent with what Jim said about this craft. Jim said that really the hole in the canopy was really only inches bigger than this craft itself. So it really did have to maneuver as it moved up. He didn't see it, of course, maneuver come in the first place. It was already on the ground by the time he got to the clearing. But it was pretty obvious to him that the branches that had been smashed off the trees had been knocked off by this craft as it had come down and as it took off again afterwards. And again, that was one thing that Colonel Holt and his team were able to document when they went out there, was that this tree damage had occurred. So we had the indentations on the ground, we had the branches smashed off. Really disconcertingly, the sides of the trees facing inwards, so the inward sides of the trees that had been really adjacent to this craft were kind of black and scorched, as if a high heat source had been there. And perhaps it was only the fact that it was pretty cold and wet had actually prevented a fire. But again, the scorch marks were obvious to the naked eye, to the people examining this landing site, if I can use that phrase. One of the people out there in Colonel Holt's team was the disaster preparedness officer. Now, he's not done too many interviews, but he has recently begun to do a couple on this, and his name is Monroe Nevels. And he's a very important part of this story because as the disaster preparedness officer, one of the things that he brought out was a Geiger counter. And Colonel Holt basically told Monroe Nevels, I want you to run the Geiger counter around the landing site and see if you pick anything up. Well, he got some moderate readings from the clearing, but when he zoomed in on the 3 indentations in the ground, and by the way, I forgot to mention, my apologies, a central but slightly less profound depression in the middle of those 3 marks, he found that he got spikes of radioactivity. And when he ran the Geiger counter along the trees that were facing inwards, that had the scorch marks on, again, he got some levels which peaked. At that point, and I'll come back to the radioactivity because this is important, but at that point, as they were documenting all of this, the tree damage, the indentations, the radioactivity, one of them shouted out, hey, look over there through the trees. And before they got the chance to light everything up with the light alls, they actually saw through the forest a bright light. And it was moving erratically, and my apologies, I don't have this set up, but some of you may be familiar with the fact that Colonel Holt, one of the things that Colonel Holt often did was that he took with him a handheld cassette recorder. A bit like, I don't know, those of you who remember the TV series Twin Peaks. Well, the lead character there, Special Agent Dale Cooper, often carried with him a handheld cassette recorder. And Colonel Holt did the same thing. And basically what he used to do is, in his duties, he used to go around and if something happened, he would document it. And if he had observations or thoughts, he would speak into his handheld cassette recorder. And this is all captured on tape. And if you go on to YouTube and you put in the phrase Holt tape, and it's HALT, you can find a 17-minute. He was out there for hours, but obviously he wasn't recording all the time. But you can find a 17-minute tape recording of him documenting the landing site. You can hear them saying, hey, you know, what's with these trees? What's caused all this damage? Okay, run the Geiger counter on that. Whoa, look at those readings. Wow, I'm really getting some levels off this. And then you'll hear them say, look over there through the trees. And you can hear the fear and tension in their voice as this UFO gets closer and closer to them. And at one point in the tape, you can hear them say, it's coming this way, it's definitely coming this way. Now, they didn't see it quite as close as Jim Penniston got on the first night. But at one point, the UFO was high up in the sky, performing erratic maneuvers, firing beams of light down at the ground. Colonel Holt said it was almost like it was looking for something. It was almost as if this thing was conducting a grid search of some point, of some kind. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get more strange, a pencil-thin beam of light, like a laser beam, shone down from the UFO and struck the ground just yards in front of them. And looking back in later years on this, Colonel Holt has asked the question, and he speculated, was this a weapon? Was this communication? Was this a warning? What was this? And he doesn't know. But what Colonel Holt, and remember, he went out there as the skeptic to try and debunk what he called this UFO nonsense, and he finds himself right in the middle of it, and he finds himself arguably to this date possibly the most senior ranking military officer ever to see and report a UFO while on duty. Colonel Holt has said, I don't know what this thing is, but whatever it is, I can tell you one thing. It was under intelligent control. And it was performing speeds and maneuvers that even now, in 2014, with all the spy planes and the drones that you see and read about, even now, he said, I can't understand how we do not have that technology. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know what it is, but kind of doesn't seem to be us. So if not us, who else? Holt and his team were out there in the forest for about 3 or 4 hours, firstly documenting the landing site, secondly themselves having their own encounter, and they saw a whole bunch of other UFO activity in the sky. I'm just editing this down to try and get everything into a reasonably concise presentation. They went way beyond the forest, out into a farmer's field beyond the forest. The very last thing they saw at about 4 a.m, as they turned round and looked back to the base, was the UFO directly over Woodbridge, firing light beams down at a particularly sensitive part of the military establishment. And a number of other UFO researchers have actually tracked down some of the people who were involved in this, and I'm still in touch with Colonel Holt. In fact, I had an email from him just yesterday about some of this. The names of the personnel who witnessed all this are known to him. There were witnesses back in the control tower watching this, and there were some people in this particularly sensitive part of the base who saw light beams strike a particular part of the military establishment. And by the way, if you think I'm being a little bit circumspect here, it's because although I left the Ministry of Defence in 2006, and although the British government is in the process of declassifying and releasing its entire archive of UFO files, I'm still bound by my secrecy oath, and there are 1 or 2 things that the British government, and indeed I think the American government, have not yet made public or admitted. So there are plenty of things that some of the witnesses will talk about, and that's their decision. But there are one or two things which, with apologies, I'm not going to be able to comment on in huge detail, but I'm sure you can kind of guess where I'm going with this when I talk about sensitive parts of the base, and maybe someone will ask it in question time. I'm sure they will. Suffice to say that for anyone that thinks that whatever UFOs might be, that this isn't a security issue and that this isn't of extreme concern to the authorities, believe me when I tell you it is. And by the way, there's one extremely interesting part of the whole Rendlesham forest story that kind of often gets overlooked. And it's this. It's an observation. But here you have, I don't think any of us would now dispute that this is a UFO incident. And here you have dozens of military personnel in the United States Air Force not only witnessing a UFO, but documenting all of this, investigating all of this, of course checking, hey, did anyone track this on radar? Yes, they did, it turns out. Shortly before the UFO was seen on the first night, it transpired that the British authorities tracked what the radar people call an uncorrelated target, or what I think the US Air Force would call a bogey, on the radar screens very briefly, and then it disappeared from the screens. Guess where? Right over the bases. So at the time all this was going on, the interesting point about this is that you have all these American military witnesses seeing a UFO, running an investigation of military people, including the deputy base commander, out there investigating these UFOs. There is perhaps a slight disconnect there. Remember the radioactivity I mentioned? I said that Monroe Neville's, Colonel Holt ordered him to run the Geiger counter over the trees, over the indentations. And he said, do that. And they documented it, and they sent the documents to the Ministry of Defense. Bear in mind, this is American bases, but on British soil. When the Ministry of Defense got Colonel Holt's report, which included the radioactivity readings that Monroe Neville's had taken with the Geiger counter, the Defense Intelligence staff did an assessment of that. And again, the document has now been declassified and released. It's out there on the British government website, National Archives, and it basically says that the levels of radioactivity recorded seem significantly higher than the average background. And that's a direct quote from the MOD's Defense Intelligence staff, the scientific and technical intelligence specialists at the Ministry of Defense. One of the other documents in the Ministry of Defense's file on this says, shortly after the incident, General Gabriel flew to the bases, was briefed on this, and took items relating to the investigation back to his headquarters. Who was General Gabriel? General Gabriel was CNC Yousefi, Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force in Europe. He was the senior United States Air Force officer anywhere in Europe. And shortly after this incident, he flew specially to the base, was briefed on this, and went back to his headquarters. If UFOs are no longer of any interest to the US government, and if the phenomenon is not being investigated, why is the senior ranking US Air Force officer in Europe taking a personal interest in a UFO sighting? We don't know. Suffice to say, some UFO researchers have gone after the paper trail. There are certainly documents in the MOD file confirming that General Gabriel visited and was briefed, but so far no one has managed to find any US Air Force documents or DOD documents that show what happened next. What happened when the general got back to his headquarters at Ramstein in Germany? What happened, what briefings were demanded by Washington, for example? That we don't know. But there is a paper trail, as I say, that certainly confirms the radioactivity levels and certainly confirms that Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force in Europe, took a close personal interest. I'm coming up to 15 minutes now, so I'm just going to make a couple of concluding remarks before I hand it over to you for comments and questions. And what I would say is this. I don't know who the person on the left is, obviously someone who's snuck into the picture and photobombed it, but you will see there, this is Jim Penniston, and this is John Burroughs. There we are. And this is a guy here, he's an attorney called Pat Frascogna, who has done a lot of pro bono work on this for John and Jim. I don't have time to go into many of the details on this, and some, of course, are personally confidential. But both John and Jim, who remember were the people who got closest to the UFO, Jim touched the side of it, maybe not a good idea, with hindsight. But both John and Jim have had some health issues which they attribute to their close proximity to the UFO. And Pat Frascogna is a crusading attorney who usually goes after corporations who environmentally pollute, that sort of thing. But he's done a lot of pro bono work with John and Jim to try to get their military medical records. Why? Because it turns out that, like I say, Jim and John think that some of their health issues are attributable to getting too close to this UFO. Turns out their military medical records are lodged in a little-known classified records section of the Veterans Administration. And so far, they have not been able to get these out. Now, this photo was taken at an event called the Citizens Hearing for Disclosure. This was a series of kind of hearings organized privately by Steve Bassett, but modeled on the sort of congressional hearings that people would like to see on UFOs. And the multi-party panel who interrogated the witnesses here, some Republicans, some Democrats, some Libertarians, all former congressional representatives, they were so outraged by the inability of John and Jim to get their military medical records that they wrote a letter both to the Secretary of the Veterans Administration and to the President of the United States. This is an ongoing story. There may yet be a federal lawsuit which involves John and Jim and maybe some of the other witnesses. Maybe they'll come in with a class action. I don't know. This is like I say, it's a story which continues to this day. Shameless plug, I teamed up with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston and we wrote this book. I'm afraid that I've sold out of copies and I wasn't able to bring any, but you can probably, it's been out for a few months, you can get you can get copies quite cheaply, I think, on Amazon. So that's our book on the subject. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of the Rendlesham Forest incident, and I would now like to thank you very much for listening, and I will turn it over to you for any comments and questions in the last 10 minutes or so. So thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you. Yes. Oh. Is there a roving microphone that that questioners can use, or can you just shout out loud then? Okay, if you can shout out fairly loud so everyone can hear. Sorry, if...
Possible viewing of entities?
Yes. Not many of the witnesses who were directly involved in this recount seeing entities. But one of the people involved, Larry Warren, who was certainly the first whistleblower of this case, has reported that he saw what he believes to be entities of some sort. And he tells a story of how on one night he believes he saw what he could only perhaps describe as maybe a planned rendezvous between this UFO, whatever it was, and some of the senior officers. Now, other military witnesses dispute Larry Warren's story, but Larry Warren has his supporters too, and it's an interesting part of this. John and Jim don't recall seeing entities, but as I say, Larry does, so who knows? And I think one of the interesting things about all of this, and one of the reasons why we wrote this book, was we know full well there are still dozens of people who were directly involved in this in some capacity, either as witnesses or as people who were involved afterwards, maybe as part of the investigation, maybe as part of the lockdown of this story, the containment of this story. Well, we want their stories too. So maybe there is more to come. Back there, yes. There has been some limited correlation of the radar data with the visual sightings. The situation is complicated by the fact that in the Ministry of Defence file for this, there is reference to some of the, firstly, the wrong dates being given, and therefore the incorrect dates being checked. And the other problem was that the way that the British radar systems were set up, they had twin screens. They had a person physically watching the first screen, and there was a second screen next to it with exactly the same data being displayed, and that was being filmed by a static camera directly above it. So there was a kind of film record of the radar tape. Now, unfortunately, and I know a lot of conspiracy theorists don't believe this, but unfortunately the answer came back that the film of the radar tapes was faulty. Unfortunately, this whole story is a list of faulty tapes and wrong dates being checked and films not coming out and documents going missing. There is a fine line, I think, with a lot of this between, where does conspiracy and bureaucracy, where's the dividing line between that? I don't know. So the answer to your question is there's been some limited attempt to correlate in the radar data, but the original tapes and films don't survive. In terms of witnesses who talk about it, there's a UFO researcher, I think, called Robert Hastings, who I believe has published two people who were involved in radar tracking of this. So I believe the names are out there. I'm afraid they slipped my memory. I think one might be Ike Turner. I apologize, I forget one name and I might be mangling the other. So the answer to your question is there is some correlation out there, but not as much as we would like. One.
Question to ask, but I don't know if it applies. When you were working with the British Minister of Defense, have you ever heard of the London landing?
Of
The London landing? There was supposed to be another ship that had actually landed in London in a parking lot. Have you ever heard of it?
No, there was nothing in the Ministry of Defence files about any landing or any other event associated with this. I'll qualify that slightly. About a month earlier, there was a sighting over South London of a kind of tetrahedral-shaped UFO, and by a bizarre coincidence, one of the witnesses was a fairly well-known researcher, UFO researcher called Timothy Good. But that was about a month before the Rendlesham Forest incident, and it certainly didn't involve a landing. It was something fairly high in the sky. There was another radar sighting involving a radar operative called Malcolm Scurra, but again that was at the end of November, I think. Tim Good's sighting was, I believe, about somewhere between the 5th and 10th of December. So there was absolutely nothing in any Ministry of Defence file about a landing in London associated with this.
So we got to be real careful about what we see on the internet.
I'm afraid so. Yes, indeed. Extreme caution.
Yes, how long was it from the book left at Eastgate until this book comes out? How much time period was?
Larry Warren, who I mentioned earlier, co-wrote with a UFO researcher called Peter Robbins a book on this case called Left at Eastgate. That was published, I believe, in 1997. Our book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, was published in March of this year. So that's the time difference. And by the way, we'll have a paperback coming out in next March, I believe. There's another book on this case called You Can't Tell the People, written by a friend of mine who's now deceased, called Georgina Bruni. So as with Roswell, there are a number of books that have been written on this case, but obviously in terms of the books that have been written, our one is the latest, and it's one written through the eyes of John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, who got closest in this. The next piece of news on this is that I occasionally hear hints that Colonel Holt might finally decide, maybe I should write something and have my say. So if Colonel Holt decides to write a book, that will be another interesting part of this story. I did not have time to get into, and Dennis just showed me the 5-minute sign, but I'm just going to maybe mention this incredibly briefly, because otherwise you'll be wondering, for those that know the story, why I didn't mention it. Jim Penniston, when he touched the side of the UFO, for years and years and years, mainly because he was afraid he would be drummed out of the military as some sort of psychological case, something strange happened to him that he kept to himself. When he touched that final symbol, not only was there a bright flash of light and the UFO slowly rose up above the ground, but he said that as he touched that symbol, through his head flashed what he could really only describe as a telepathic download of ones and zeros. The so-called binary message, the Rendlesham code, whatever you want to see it. It's been covered briefly in a couple of the most recent UFO documentaries on this case. I don't have to tell you how hugely controversial it is. A computer programming expert called Nick Sisk was hired by History Channel to do a kind of decode on what it might mean for one of the previous TV shows. He came up with a decoding of this 16 pages of ones and zeros, which read: exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of our eyes, origin year 8100, which many people, of course, have taken to mean origin year 8100. Maybe we're talking about not extraterrestrials, but time travelers. Otherwise, why would it say origin year 8100? Unless that's an alien calendar, I don't know. And then following this message was a series of what looked like geographical coordinates. The Nazca lines in Peru, the Temple of Apollo in Greece, the Great Pyramid at Giza, which Dennis spoke about earlier, the mythical lost continent of High Brazil, sometimes dubbed the Celtic Atlantis. Again, this is hugely controversial. Some UFO researchers take great exception to this. They think it's far too kind of New Age for what they believe is a nuts and bolts phenomenon. Work to try and get to the bottom of this so-called binary code, Rendlesham message, whatever you call it. Work is ongoing. There are a couple of websites devoted to this. Just Google phrases like the Rendlesham binary code and you'll find them. It's a fascinating part of what is still, I think, an ongoing story, a story that we haven't yet heard the last of. With that, I'm afraid I think I'm going to have to wrap up because Dennis gave me the 5-minute warning and I've probably gone on, but I'm going to be around for a while. I'm going to the Dude of the Dead Music Festival, of course, to have some Southwest cuisine, some Mexican food, maybe have a couple of cold ones if there's a beer tent. And so with that in mind, I'm going to be around for those of you that didn't get to ask a comment or a question. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you found the account of the Rendlesham Forest incident to be as fascinating as I've found trying to get to the bottom of what I still think is a case which in years to come will be as well known as, and perhaps one day, maybe even better known than Roswell. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
You're listening to IRN 2014 Order Zone International UFO Conference.